Okay, great. Let's welcome Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas. Later today, he plans to introduce some new legislation that would block China from owning U.S. land. Thanks for joining us, Senator. There's the Speaker is winging her ways across parts of that part of the world right now. She is over Indonesia, I'm told, and we'll see. Could land sometime in the next couple of hours, but we don't know for sure. You've been to Taiwan, have you not, Senator?
I have been to Taiwan. Like many legislators, I've been to Taiwan. It's a longstanding tradition in our relationship with Taiwan that while we tend not to send executive branch officials, that legislators do frequently travel there. Nancy Pelosi has been there before. Another Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, has been there. 6 years ago, I went there with a large group of senators, and we went on one of these so-called military aircraft, which is not a stealth bomber or a fighter. It's simply a commercial aircraft that the military owns to transport government officials around the world. China complains about it any time a legislator goes to Taiwan, but we've never had this level of tension, and it's because Joe Biden chose to make this an issue. There's no reason to escalate this last month and say the military didn't want her to travel or to leak her travel plans or to put pressure on her. It is an example of how Beijing is trying to rewrite the status quo, that Beijing is the one taking provocative actions, and Joe Biden is very worried about that, so he begins to scramble publicly. If he had just treated this like every other president has treated legislative trips to Taiwan in the past, I don't think we would have seen this level of tension.
What do you think is in the back? We've been trying to figure out President Xi's mindset on a lot of things. We know that what's coming up soon, it's going to be a lot of celebration about his expected third term, whatever you want to call it, as the leader of China. Do you think that this is somewhat of a diversion from some of the domestic problems in terms of the economy or the unpopular COVID lockdowns, whatever that is? Would it be smart for President Xi, or does it make sense that he wants to get some nationalist fervor stirred up before that happens, or do you think he'd like things to be calm before that event?
Joe, I think mostly he's just trying to see what he can get away with. You know, we're almost a year to the day from the fall of Kabul to the Taliban last year. China's giant state-run propaganda outlet referred then to a so-called Afghan effect, and you're continuing to see this Afghan effect. Xi Jinping is trying to rewrite the status quo in our relationship with Taiwan because he thinks he can get away with it. And he already has, in some ways, changed that status quo because he's elevated just a routine legislative trip to Taiwan to something that requires presidential level attention and presidential level pressure. It's very important that we not allow him to do that, that once Speaker Pelosi goes to Taiwan, we make it clear that we'll continue to send legislators there. Kevin McCarthy, who'll be the Speaker in January, said he may travel the next year. We need to make it clear to Xi Jinping that we will not back down from this long-standing relationship. So I think that's what he's up to. He just feels that he can get away with something like this. That's why it's so important that he doesn't. Because with dictators everywhere and always, once they get away with one provocation, they'll always be back for more.
Do you think that the Biden administration at this point will harden its stance in terms of how much defense we would provide for Taiwan? You've seen President Biden in the past has said, and I don't know if he was mistaken, what he said. It was walked back, obviously, by some other members of his administration. But there are some people saying now, if it becomes clear China is not going to do it in the way that was planned, doing it in a negotiated fashion with Taiwan, but actually that they are going to do it militarily, that we should change our position, say we would at least help Taiwan defend itself, which I don't think that's part of the one China policy right now. Should it shift to that, where we make a commitment?
So, Joe, as conditions and circumstances change, sometimes policies have to change. And conditions have changed in the Western Pacific to the point where we do need to change our policy and explicitly state clearly and deliberately that we will aid Taiwan if China goes for the jugular there. For decades, we've been ambiguous about that, what's known as strategic ambiguity. But for most of the last 40 years, it's not been clear that the People's Liberation Army had anywhere near the military capacity to execute an invasion of Taiwan. Now it is pretty clear, or at least arguable, that they can execute that operation. That's why we should change our position and say, we don't want war, but we will deter war by making it clear that we'll come to Taiwan's aid. Now, Joe Biden 3 times in 9 months said that, only to have his anonymous White House aides immediately walk it back. That gave us the worst of both worlds. We got the provocation of Beijing without the deterrence of Beijing. That's why it's so important that this president, in a planned, deliberate speech with prepared remarks that are released in advance, makes clear that America will not tolerate communist China going for the jugular in Taiwan and forcibly annexing it back into mainland China. That's the best way to avoid what no one wants, which is a war with China in the Western Pacific.
Hey, Senator, what do you make of the idea that, you have to pick your fights? You have to choose when to pursue your fights, and that this may not be the right time, that this is about ego rather than actually strategy. And I want to read you, this is from Tom Friedman this morning, why Pelosi's visit to Taiwan is utterly reckless. He writes, if she goes ahead with the visit against Biden's wishes, she will be doing something that is utterly reckless, dangerous, and irresponsible. Nothing good will come of it, he writes. Taiwan will not be more secure or more prosperous as a result of this purely symbolic visit, and a lot of bad things could happen. And if you think our European allies who are facing an existential war with Russia over Ukraine will join us if there's U.S. conflict with China over Taiwan, triggered by this unnecessary visit, you are badly misreading the world. What do you make of that?
Well, Tom Friedman has been apologizing for Chinese communists for 20 years and hoping that the Democratic Party here in America could emulate the power that Chinese communists have. So I'm not sure I'd take advice from Tom Friedman about China. But what I would say is that Joe Biden should not have responded to these Chinese provocations last month. He's the one that stepped out in public. He's the one that said our military doesn't want her to travel there when American legislators have been traveling to China for 4 decades. There was no reason to respond as he did to these Chinese threats. China makes these kind of threats all the time. And to escalate them to something that requires public presidential attention and to continue these leaks about how she's being provocative, how she shouldn't be traveling there, how our military is worried about it, is only playing into Beijing's hands.
Senator, you may not be wrong about that, meaning it may very well have been a terrible mistake by the White House to send these types of messages out the way they have, or to react the way they have. But given that they have, and given the moment and situation that we're in, to some level, it now feels like a provocation. And to the extent that the Chinese, and I'm not defending the Chinese in this instance, but culturally, they like this idea of a certain type of respect. You might describe it as mutual respect. You might describe it as not mutual at all. But whatever it is, to the degree that you think that we should have good relations, or at least try to have workable relations with China, does this help?
Well, I think what wouldn't help, in fact, what would hurt very badly, is to back down into the face of these threats. Just imagine all the other capitals that Nancy Pelosi is going to visit, in Tokyo and in Seoul, for that matter, our allies around the world. If the slightest threat to an American speaker traveling to Taiwan caused us to back down, caused Joe Biden to withdraw military support for her travel, which is routine not only for her travel, but any legislature traveling around the world, what would that say about America's strength and resolve and credibility? It would be more dangerous to back down under these threats than it is to proceed with what is, once again, a routine trip. Xi Jinping knows it's a routine trip. He knows that this is perfectly within the normal status quo going back 40 years. He's simply trying to see what he can get away with Joe Biden being nervous in the White House.
What do you foresee as how it plays out, Senator? We're seeing some movement in the respective naval operations in the area and positioning here, positioning there. I don't know whether our guys are going to accompany the speaker's jet right into Taipei. If she does go there, we have to use all these caveats and ifs. But do you expect largely symbolic things? You don't expect an overt, you don't expect them to force her plane down or to forcibly not allow her to land. Do you expect anything to that extent at this point? Is that possible?
No, Joe, I don't expect that. I do expect our military to be postured in a way that will protect America's interests and American officials around the world, to include Taiwan, where we've been traveling for 40 years. I expect the Speaker will visit with high-level Taiwanese officials, as I have on my past trips, as many senators and representatives have in the past. And I expect China will huff and puff about it, but in the end, China doesn't want a war in the Western Pacific, especially, as you mentioned earlier, Joe, on the eve of Xi Jinping getting an unprecedented 5-year term, any more than we do. And the best way to avoid that is to be firm and resolute in the face of Chinese threats.
Senator, I don't know if everyone realized that even Speaker Pelosi has been to, I guess she wasn't Speaker, so there's, I guess when we say a high-level official hasn't been there since 1997, we're not trying to disrespect you, but I guess you weren't, a couple of years ago, you weren't really high enough level to be called that.
Well, Joe, what I want to say...
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's not so much about how long someone has served or whether they're high or a backbench. It's the distinction in the custom and practice between the Congress and the executive branch.
The executive branch does it.
For 40 years, members of Congress had traveled to Taiwan. The Chinese communists know that. The members of the executive branch in general have not. It's not a universal rule, but it's the general custom and practice since we recognized Beijing and ended our formal diplomatic relationship with Taiwan in the late 1970s, that members of Congress travel to Taiwan frequently, but members of the executive branch generally do not. That's why this is completely within the norms and the status quo of our relationship going back 40 years. Xi Jinping is trying to forcibly alter that status quo.
All right. Great. Thanks, Senator. Senator Cotton, good to have you on. And you know, we hope you're right about exactly how this all plays out. These are unprecedented times, so many different things that we never thought we'd have to worry about that we now worry about. But thank you, Senator.